For today's project, I'm going to show you how I created these custom wall panels. We'll talk about how I did the inner corners, the outer corners, and everything in between, and how you can customize this look so that it works for you. So stay tuned. The first thing you're going to need to do before you put the paneling in is prep the walls. And what I like to do is start by fixing any kind of problems with the drywall. Go ahead, skim coat it, make it nice and smooth, and then go ahead and paint it in the color that you're going to use for the trim. That's because in between the panels, you're actually going to see the drywall. Now, if you don't prep the walls and make them look nice, then they're going to show through. So that part of this project isn't going to look great. So prepping the walls is really important. The second thing you're going to want to do is go ahead and snap a chalk line across the entire room at the height that you want the paneling to be. And this is important because floors go up and down, but you want the wainscoting or the paneling to be perfectly straight around the room. It's okay to have a little gap down by the floor because we can cover that up with shoe molding later. What we don't want to see is any kind of wavering at the top as you go around the room. This project is really repetitive. So we're just going to show you how to go ahead and do an inside corner and an outside corner. If you can do those two pieces, you can do any room. Now, once you have that reference line snapped, the next thing we can do is go ahead and cut the baseboards. So let's go ahead and measure up for the baseboards and we'll go ahead and install them. Okay, I cut the two baseboards and we're gonna start on this wall over here that has both the inside corner and the outside corner. So as you can see, when I lay this in place, the board goes all the way up to this wall and it overhangs on the other wall by 3/4 of an inch. This 3/4 of an inch is so that we have enough to match up with the opposing baseboard and it covers up the edge. Now the board that goes on this wall is cut so it fits snugly between the board on that side and against the molding behind me. And one thing you might notice right now is I am not using any kind of miter joints, I am just using butt joints. These are easier, and to tell you the truth, using 45-degree miter joints is much more difficult to actually match up and make it look nice later because of some of the unevenness of the walls than just using standard butt joints, and I'll show you why that works in a little bit. We can go ahead and, might as well, while you're cutting those, cut the top plates that match. So these are the top plates that go with these baseboards, and the top plates are 1x6s while this bottom board is a 1x12. Now, while I was cutting these baseboards, I went ahead and cut those vertical pieces, and this is where you can kind of be creative. There are some guidelines about how high wainscoting or wall paneling should be, but the reality is no one really follows it anymore. I see tons of stuff that's done every which height and it all looks good, so you do what you think is going to look best in your room. So these heights are up to you. Now, the way mine are cut, the entire height of this wall panel will be about 48 inches, including the cap once it's done. Now, this is something you can figure out beforehand, but the important thing is when you cut these, cut them all even because you want the height as it goes around the room to be perfect. Now, we're going to line it up against that line across the top when we're done, so we'll know that'll be nice and level. The only difference you might have are some fluctuations along the floor line where it doesn't match perfectly because the floors aren't flat, but we can fix that with a nice piece of shoe molding near the end of the project. This is the part we're going to be a little bit careful about. When we install these vertical pieces, they're going to be a little bit different depending on where they're located, such as up against a piece of trim molding or on an inside corner versus an outside corner. And that's to make sure that all of these have the same perceived depth and they all look the same as we go around the room, and that one looks a little bit bigger than the other. Starting over at the trim, it's pretty easy. We're just going to put one right here that matches up exactly with the edge of the board we already have in place on the base. Now you'll start to see a gap possibly over here on the side, and that's because this board is leaning down. We're going to put this frame together square because remember, when we line it up against this top line later, everything's going to be level across that and it should be square against the side as well. If there's still a little bit of gap, we'll have to do a little bit of filler work, but we'll worry about that later. Here's where it gets a little interesting. The horizontal that goes over here is not going to go straight to the wall like this. It's actually going to go only to the edge of the bottom baseboard. And the reason for that is when we put this second piece in over here, this piece is going to go just slightly over the edge of the baseboard towards the inside wall. And what this will do is they'll just overlap slightly, and you'll have roughly the same thickness from here to here as from here to here. If you were to push this all the way up against the wall, you'd actually have a slimmer side over here and a thicker side over here. You will have a hole or a gap that goes down through the top, but once we cover that with a cap, no one will ever see it, and it saves you a bunch of cuts of having to cut different size pieces of wood for these vertical pieces. Carefully lay the top piece on, and we can get a pretty good idea what one of the frames is going to look like before we do all the decorative touches. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to screw this together with pocket holes, and then we'll bring it back up and we'll start assembling the far wall. Now I put the whole frame together and I put it up against the wall, and you can see how it fits into place, but there are some issues with it not lining perfectly along the sides, and that's because the unevenness of the floor. Don't worry, we will fix that. Now I've also gone ahead and added the vertical member of this wall so that we can start lining this up. What you will notice is that I left it off on this side. As I square this up, I might need to move this outside corner in and out. And when I do that, it will change the gap on that side. So since I have an extra 3/4 inch going in, as long as this is not 3/4 inch or more out of whack, I can hide that when I put that other vertical member in. And when you're doing an outside corner, you don't want to fully assemble the part that's overlapping the outside. What you want to do is you want to leave it just dry fitted in place with that other member off so that you can adjust it if you need to move this in or out. Then you want to place in this wall panel. And again, I left the outside piece off so that we can make any adjustments if needed. So with this in place, we can see the inside part is flush. And now we need to make sure that this outside part is also flush. Now to check this, what we can do is we can take the vertical that will go up against this and hold it in place, but we don't need to do anything other than make sure this part overlaps perfectly with the edge. So right now I can see that it's a little bit too far in. So I'll make that adjustment. Now that we have this edge roughed in place, you can see that as I put this vertical in, the spacing on this side is not equal anymore. Now, the reason for this is that this piece is exactly the same as every other vertical component. However, when I do the corner, there's an extra 3/4 inch that add on to this, making this part longer. So we're gonna have to take this piece over to the table saw and cut off 3/4 inch so that it's all even. Now I'm about to give you one of the most important tips when it comes to putting these outside corners in place. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone, this is about the time that you usually get interrupted in every project. The most important part. Whether it's Now interruptions can come in a lot of forms. Maybe your wife interrupted you, maybe your husband, maybe your children, maybe you thought you could run one of the hardest 10Ks in the country and now you can barely move. So now's a good time to go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. It'll make it much easier to find this content once you're up and running again and ready to restart the project. Okay, so I have screwed in this vertical piece and it is roughed in place next to the one from the opposing wall. If you take a piece of wood and you cut it exactly to the size of the bottom, as you can see here, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fit correctly up here. And again, things are crooked. Wood can be warped, walls can be out of square. So in this case, that is why I've left this off for now. The easiest thing to do, especially when you only have a small gap like I have here, is to take a larger piece and then go ahead and scribe it along the back of the wall and cut it to that. Once you do that, When you put the pocket screws in, you'll be able to flush it up against the edges, and you can very quickly close a small gap like this. Now, if you have a much bigger gap because of a much more crooked wall, then you're going to have to do something a little bit more difficult, such as maybe cut these on an angle. But if you have that, that's more of an advanced topic. Okay, there we have it, and we now have this frame all roughed into place. So we can go ahead and we can move on to doing the final vertical of the wall over here. Now, to finish off this wall, we're gonna have to deal with this inside corner. So what I've done is I've just laid this piece in. It's not nailed, not screwed, not glued, nothing. And the same with the top piece. This top piece is just actually holding this wall square, while I just go ahead and maneuver this piece in and out so that this edge is just hidden behind this edge over here from this wall. So now that we have this lined up the way we want it, we're going to go ahead and we're going to mark it on the bottom and the top so we know where to line it up. So when we put the pocket hole screws in, everything is in the same position as we have it right now. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll get on to a very unique part of this wall where we have a little bit of a problem that we need to address. Now we have both the outside corner and the inside corner and all the panels roughed in. We can take a look at it and clear up any kind of issues we might have. First off, you want to check that everything is level and that it's lined up with the mark that you put on the wall with the chalk. Here is where you might have an issue. If everything is great, you're good to go for the next step, which is to adhere these panels to the wall. But if you have an issue like I do, where there is a little bit of a lip over here, then you're going to have to address that. Now, the reason I'm having this issue is because the floor isn't straight. So as you can see right here, it touches the floor near me, but as it goes out to the far end, it is a bit of a gap. To solve this issue and to make this all come flush to the floor, again, this is being caused by a slight rise in the floor, we're going to have to scribe the bottom and cut a little bit off with the jigsaw. This is not that hard of a task to do. When you cut it with the jigsaw, it might be a little rough, but remember, we're going to have shoe molding all across the bottom, and that will cover up any little imperfections we might have. Now, I'm going to go ahead and scribe the bottom. Now, I'm not going to do this here, but I did make a video on Scribing 101. I will put that somewhere up above me, and you can click on that and learn about how to do the scribing process. So I scribed the bottom, I cut this panel, and I put it back in place. And as you can see, it really doesn't make a difference how well you cut the bottom of the panel. I actually cut it pretty poorly with a pretty dull blade. So once you put the shoe molding on this, it will cover up that cut and no one will ever see it. Now, the important thing is that it is now conforming to the floor, and when we look at the level, it is still level, and also there is now no gap from this wall to this wall. So everything is nice and aligned across our chalk line. Now that all the panels are dry fitted in place, we'll adhere them to the wall using construction adhesive and some brad nails to hold it while it's drying. All right, I gave the panels overnight to dry, and now that they're kind of locked in place, it's time to add all the details that are going to make this look really nice. So the first thing I'm going to start with is laying these inlays. Now, these inlays can really be anything you want, and you can be quite creative with this, but I'm just going to use simple cove, and we're just going to box in the inside of this frame. And this is pretty easy. Just cut these on 45s and lay them in place. Once we have these dry fitted in place and we know they all fit, we're going to go ahead and we'll go around the whole outside edge with 18 gauge brad nails. We're getting towards the finish line now. The next step is just to put in the shoe molding, and this shoe molding will cover up that pretty nasty cut I did earlier. See? You won't even see it. Hey you, do you mind holding this in place while I nail it down? For the cap, we're just using simple 1x2. We'll put a little piece of decorative trim underneath this in a second to make it look nicer. But for now, let's just go ahead and install the caps all the way around. Now, the final thing we're going to do is install a nice piece of finished trim just underneath these caps. It will give it a nice finished look, and this is pretty easy to install. Again, we're just going to do 45s and put it right in, go around the wall. You could use pretty much anything you want for this. It's really just changes the way it looks, and that's up to you. So we'll go ahead and install this, and then we'll be done with all the framing and all the nailing and everything else to get the wood paneling on the wall, and we can go about finishing it off. A couple of quick tips. The first being these end grains. If you want to finish them up and make them look nice, you can just put some wall spackle over the edge to kind of seal them and then sand over it, and no one will ever notice that these were here. So just one final tip before we go ahead and paint this is that it's not going to be perfect. The walls being crooked, I always have issues with things lining up and there's gaps, but there's a way to clean that up and make sure that they don't re-gap themselves as you know, the weather changes and the walls and the wood and everything else expands and contracts. And that is to use a really good quality painter's caulk. You just go in, fill all the holes, clean it up nicely, and then when you paint over it, no one will ever know the difference and it will look perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and caulk all this and paint it, and once I'm done, we'll take a look at the final finished product. Now I still need to do a little bit of touch up, but this is what the final product looks like after we get some paint on it and caulk everything up. As you can see, it is a big transformation. Now that I showed you how to do the inner corners and the outer corners, all you have to do is space out the vertical members in whatever looks good for your room, and then finish it off the same way we did these inside and outside corners. Well, that wraps up the project. So if you liked this video, be sure to like us down below and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And until next time, if you have any questions, leave a comment. I'll make sure that I answer them as fast as possible, and we'll see you on the next project. We're actually going to attach it right here at the edge of the baseboard. And a couple of quick trips. How can I speak?